let's talk about a game changer in gaming. So, 1995 was, of course, still during the many years of fighting game genre just being everywhere. This was still during the time of Street Fighter II, or in probably by about this point, Super Street Fighter II, Street Fighter Turbo, all those new editions just being pumped out and just everybody eating it up. And then there was also Mortal Kombat, and this is around the time of Mortal Kombat 3. And a game came to consoles, and I never originally played it in the arcade. But this was a game I did play on the console, and this was certainly something different. Weapon Lord for Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. I never actually played Genesis version until sometime recently. Super Nintendo version I originally grew up with. I didn't know anything about the game. I remember I saw snippets of it in a magazine, and I remember thinking, wow, this actually looks kind of cool, particularly with what they were presenting and what they were talking about. A fighting game mechanic that allowed for pairing and counter systems, and even interlocking systems. Something very similar to what you probably saw in a lot of the Samurai Showdown arcade games originally. And I don't remember when exactly Samurai Showdown originally came out. But anyway, this was kind of the game that also helped inspire, because it's also made by Namco. This was the same company that would later go on to make the Soul Calibur series. So you can certainly see that. And I have certainly seen a lot of gameplay footage from the Genesis version. And from everything I've read up, the major differences, and this has always been kind of a qualm, as everybody knows, between Super Nintendo and Sega, is that primarily Super Nintendo always tends to sound better, and tends to look better too. And this is a thorough definition of that. Super Nintendo version looks better and sounds better. The Sega version soundtrack, everything sounds a little bit murky, and like there's too much static behind everything, and the visuals are kind of faded. Because originally the game, from what I've read, was originally made for Super Nintendo, and apparently it also got ported for the Genesis, and it just came out very poorly. And I was reading something as well that said, can't remember what I was going to say now. Crap. But so yeah, so this was another fighting game that introduced a few very interesting tactics. We already had a lot of the fatalities and a lot of the blood and gore. This was a game, though, that when you performed executions upon your opponents, it was something that you did while performing a combo. That if you executed it properly, you could, chop off your opponent's head, or like chop them in half, or where you could just utterly massacre them. If you could perform just a high number of combos at the end of the final match, you could just obliterate your opponent. You could chop off their head, and then obliterate their head, and then obliterate their body. Very violent. And just a very good game with a very interesting combat system. And the moveset, though, for this game can be a little hard to understand, in that, so whenever you perform a special move, as opposed to, the traditional Mortal Kombat or even Street Fighter style, where you do half circle and then, and you hit whatever attack button. Instead, for this game, you have to hold down the attack button, and then you have to move the joystick or the controller in a particular fashion, and then your character will perform the move. And characters can have several different types of moves, not just 3, like in any other typical fighting game. They'll have several different moves. And I mean, I remember I played through usually as the male characters, be it Kor or Zorn or Zorak or Bane. Bane not so much because his reach was pretty limited, but I like Kor mostly because he looked like a really cool guy and he carried a big ass sword, and I liked his special moves because I remember a lot of his special moves were his sword would suddenly become just engulfed in flame, and then he'd do this really cool and complex sort of spin with it. And then there were other types of moves or performances that he would do with that particular move. He'd do some sort of a jump assault, he'd do a slide assault, he'd do a hard uppercut, he would do a sword dive, all sorts of different moves. This was also a game that introduced a parry system, where with the light attack function, if you held down the light attack and then you pressed in any direction, be it up, forwards, or down, your character would thrust out their weapon in sort of a blocking fashion. But it wasn't a block, it was basically a parry. And if your opponent attacked you the minute that you did that, they would knock against your weapon, but then they would kind of become stunned. So then you would have the advantage and could attack. That was certainly something very new that really hadn't been done before. Now, naturally, all fighting games, particularly weapon fighting games, use that feature and that function a lot. And I remembered what it was I was going to say. And this is regards to some of the features versus Super Nintendo or Sega. I remember some time ago, my stepsister, she had a Sega Genesis and she used to bring it over. And primarily the game I would play on it a lot was Beavis and Butthead at the time. And she also had a copy of Mortal Kombat 3. I was never really a fan of Mortal Kombat 3, and I know this is going to sound dumb because my favorite character, Scorpion, was not on it. At least not until a year or so later when they did Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. But yeah. I remember playing Mortal Kombat 3 on the Sega Genesis I didn't like it because the sound was just garbage. It was terrible. Absolutely terrible. I remember you could barely hear any of the music because the music would be muffled in the background because there would be this loud sort of buzzing, static sound. And it just made it kind of hard to try to enjoy the game with this annoying sound just buzzing through and buzzing over the music. Just made it insufferable. And really, I didn't own a Sega Genesis until many years later. Until I, started working and saved money and then just went out and bought myself a Sega Genesis. And some games that I had a lot of interest in, really wanted to play. And, God, I have too many systems now. But yeah, and a while ago, quite some time ago, I think maybe some years ago, somebody on YouTube actually did a full sort of retrospective video on Weapon Lord, and basically just praised the game for doing everything that it did that kind of helped redefine fighting games in a way, with some of the interesting mechanics that they introduced. And I haven't played this game in a while. mean, I imagine, I would get my ass kicked if I were to just play this game now on any sort of a normal difficulty. But, I mean, this is a game I remember playing with friends, and they didn't quite understand it or really get it. And they would just get their asses kicked and then be like, can we just play Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat instead of this? But, this was certainly a fighting game that was a hell of a lot better than any other common imitator at the time, like a game like Rise of the Robots. Of course, I forget exactly when that game came out, but that was just a bad game. But yeah, if you can find a copy of Weapon Lord and you have any sort of interest in these type of games, I mean, it certainly has a good story. It has very good fighting mechanics. And I don't remember if it has a training mode or not. I think it does, actually. It has a versus mode, arcade, story mode, if you care at all about that. Stories can often be good, and for two core characters, like Core and Bane, they actually have a pretty damn good story to them. And, and I can appreciate any fighting game that actually bothers to have a story, particularly a good one. So, if you have any interests, and you can find I'm sure you can find this game for a decent price, certainly check it out on the Super Nintendo. Weapon Lord. Damn good game. See ya.